All right, here's MDub. Gonna get you ready for the final. So let's get it on. All right, your final is going to be basically 4 parts: World War I, the world between the wars, World War II, and finally the Cold War. So some things to remember about World War I. The Central Powers, as you can see in the map: Germany, the most powerful; Austria-Hungary in the middle; and the sick man of Europe, the weakest link in the Central Powers of World War I, the Ottoman Empire. The Triple Entente, the three friends, remember: Russia, England, and France. So remember the Central Powers, the bad guys of World War I. Life on the Western Front, where most of the deaths occurred in World War I. Nasty, dirty, sickness, disease, trenches. So try to imagine what life is like in the border between Germany and France. Trench warfare from the English Channel all the way to Switzerland. Rats, disease, and poison gas, the most feared weapon in the trenches. The silent killer. Total war. World War I is the first time that there is a complete mobilization of resources and people to support the war effort. That means supplies, food, blankets, clothing, boots. Touched every person's life in World War I. Total war. Okay. Why did the United States enter the war? Basically, public opinion is going to have to shift towards the British, the Allies, the French. Number one, the Zimmerman Note. That was the proposal by Germany to Mexico. Invade the United States. If you could win that with Germany's help, you could take back part of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California. Prevent the United States from entering the war in Europe. The Mexican government declined to participate in that business. The sinking of the Lusitania, a passenger ship off the coast of England, contained civilians, Americans. Again, turns public opinion against the Germans. And finally, the use by the Germans of their submarines to sink all ships approaching England. It was called unrestricted submarine warfare. Even some of our naval vessels were attacked by the Germans before we get involved in the war. So public opinion shifts against Germany because of all three of these events. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, part of World War I, is Russia's withdrawal from the fighting. It's signed by Russia and Germany after Lenin leads the Communist Revolution. It takes Russia out of the war. And in exchange for a peace agreement with Germany, Russia is going to give up land to Germany and Austria-Hungary. Some of the best farmlands, lots of people, factories to support the German war effort. So the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And here's the map. You can see Germany is going to gain a lot of land in the north. Austria-Hungary is given land in the south. All because Lenin pulls his nation out of the war. Very unpopular with the common Russian people. Rationing. Rationing means you can't get everything you want anytime you want it. And in World War I, governments adopt a command economy. They control where all the supplies go, how much everyone gets. Most of the supplies are needed by the soldiers. There's no freeze-dried foods. Canned foods weren't a huge part of the war effort, so everything has to be fresh. So mandatory reductions in consumption at home. So if you weren't fighting in World War I, you were asked to cut back, eat less meat. In the United States, cut back on wheat and flour, switch to corn. Many people plant gardens during World War I and World War II to support the war effort. And it was promoted by the governments, enforced by the governments, so that most of the supplies, things produced, would be given to the soldiers. Food, gasoline, metal for ammunition. So it's called rationing, where you can't get everything you want anytime you want it. So what exactly causes World War I? Well, it's the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. in a tiny country called Serbia. His assassination is the spark that started World War I. The alliance system kicks in. Austria-Hungary threatens Serbia, full of Russians. Russia moves troops to the border, and Germany sees that as their opportunity to put their plan into effect. So the assassination of the Archduke and his wife in the city of Sarajevo by Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip is the spark that gets the gears in motion that leads to World War I. Rest in peace, Archduke. So what was Germany's plan? It's called the Schlieffen Plan. Germany had created this years before the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. They knew something was going to happen at some point. Their main target is Paris, France. So the Schlieffen Plan, basically, the Germans planned on fighting a two-front war. To the east, they're going to go up against the Russians, very unprepared, so they're going to need a small amount of troops. Send them east. The majority of their troops, send them through Belgium, neutral Belgium. And you can see in this map, the French had fortress towns built along the border of France and Germany, but they failed to reinforce their border with Belgium. So obviously the Germans said this is the place we're going to go, through a neutral country. In the east, again, a holding action. So not all the troops, but a few. Russia is very ill-equipped, so it shouldn't be that big of a problem just to hold them off in case they decide to do anything about it. And when Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated and the Russians move troops to the borders with Austria-Hungary and Serbia, the Schlieffen Plan is put into effect. The Germans believed that the war would be over by Christmas if they could move fast enough to take Paris. Major failure of the German war effort is the Schlieffen Plan wasn't executed fast enough and to the letter. And they will not take Paris. Soviets. Part of World War I is the Russian Revolution, and Soviets simply means councils. And in Petrograd, where the February Revolution first takes place, it's a naval base. One of the first things that the Bolsheviks, under Lenin, do is they give power to the people. Local councils made up of workers in the factories, soldiers. So they're given the power and they love it. After the Civil War, after World War I, that's why it's called the Soviet Union. Okay, the Council of Union. Okay, many different councils composed of workers and soldiers and party members, all going to run the new Soviet Union after World War I ends. Okay, so know what the term Soviet means. Simply means a council made up of the workers and the soldiers, part of the Russian Revolution. So the main causes of the Great War, very simple to remember, M-A-I-N. M is militarism, the buildup of weapons, soldiers, supplies. A is alliances, and again, the alliances, the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The Triple Entente, the three friends, Russia, England, and France. Imperialism, the competition for colonies, and we looked at that in the unit leading up to World War I, end of last semester. Imperialism, competition causes conflict, and the prize for winning the war is the losers lose all their colonies, especially in Africa and Asia, all of the raw materials, the cheap resources, the labor. That was the great prize of winning World War I. And finally, nationalism. And nationalism is simply the love of one's country, the belief that right or wrong, our country is better than yours. Throughout Europe during this time period, pre-World War I, strong feelings of nationalism. In England, for example, God save the king, fighting for king and country, very important. So militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, the main causes of the Great War. Propaganda plays a huge part in World War I and II. Propaganda encouraged men to enlist. It also encouraged people to support the war effort. It was their patriotic duty. And part of propaganda also included shaming people. So if you don't support the war, if you're a man and you don't join the military, that was shameful. What kind of man are you? And in this particular poster, you can see this man and his children are asking him, "What did you do in the Great War, Dad?" And he's kind of feeling bad about it. He didn't serve. He's thinking, well, I didn't really do much. I kind of worked in my job, my bakery, whatever. I didn't actually go out and fight. So enlistment propaganda encouraged patriotism and shamed people that didn't participate in the war effort. The Armenian Genocide, one of the dark chapters of World War I, is the actions of the Ottoman Muslims against Christians in the Turkish peninsula. 800,000 Armenian Christians are estimated to have been massacred by the Ottomans during the war, all because they were Christians. And the Ottomans believed that they could be spies for the Russians. So I'll show you in the map coming up in the next slide how widely scattered the Armenians were. And this is why the Muslim Ottomans feared them and systematically exterminated them, marched them through the desert to camps, executed them in large numbers, buried them in mass graves. So in World War II, you know about the Holocaust and the 6 million Jews and 3 million others that were exterminated by the Nazis. But World War I has a similar event. It's called the Armenian Genocide. And here's the map, and you can see how widely scattered the Armenians were. So why the Ottomans felt they were such a threat, you can see to the northeast up against the Russian border. So how can you deal with these people if you don't trust them? Well, very simple. Extermination. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, the man that leads the communist revolution in Russia. Very important part of World War I. Founds the Bolshevik Party, which was a radical party. They used violence to achieve their goal. Later renamed the Communist Party. But Lenin's goal, he was smuggled in by the Germans. He hated the Tsar. Destabilize the government, see if you can pull the Russians out of the war, thus allowing the Germans to focus their full effort against the French. And Lenin was successful and successfully brought down the Tsar. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. So why were the Romanovs so hated by the general population in Russia? Well, the royal family policies, living like kings, basically an absolute monarch. Russia, basically the common people were still living in a state of serfdom, tied to the land, working for very little. And when World War I broke out, many of them didn't know why they were being asked to fight and die for a guy that they didn't like anyway. So here's a picture of Nicholas I and his lovely family. During the Civil War that follows Lenin's pulling out of World War I, the Tsar and his entire family will be found. They will be executed, thus ending the Romanov dynasty in Russia. So World War I caused more hardships than the people were used to. Shortages, death, destruction. And communism ultimately is the downfall of the Tsar. Marxist ideology, the belief that power belongs with the workers. And in the February Revolution and then the October Revolution, when the military soldiers themselves turned against the Tsar, Lenin basically had Russia right where he wanted them. Causes of defeat of the Central Powers, pretty simple. Once Russia pulls out and things look grim, this is when the United States enters the war. And with the help of the United States, fresh troops, fresh supplies, the superior manpower of the Allies is overwhelming to the Central Powers. Their lack of supplies is also an issue. They've been fighting 3 years against the Allies. Both sides were straining to supply their troops. But the German population itself was down to about 2,000 calories a day in food. Eating all their animals, basically 2,000 calories is about 4 Snickers bars. And finally, food shortages and supply shortages caused by especially the British blockading the ports. So nothing could get into Germany from anywhere in the world. strangle the most powerful member of the Central Forces. That's the way you're going to get them to ultimately surrender. The Treaty of Versailles, the peace treaty at the end of World War I, very harsh on the Germans. Germany is going to end up losing all of its colonies in Africa. They're going to be blamed completely for starting the war. Their military is basically stripped down, no navy, no air force, decrease in their troop numbers. Basically, it was an extremely harsh peace. Most historians believe that the Treaty of Versailles is what created the environment for Adolf Hitler and the rise of the Nazi Party, and is a direct cause within 20 years of World War II breaking out, the Treaty of Versailles. The Rhineland is a region between Germany and France. The Germans weren't allowed to have any military troops whatsoever in this region, basically leaving an open door if the French ever wanted to come in and do whatever they wanted in Germany. Reaction to the Treaty of Versailles, German people felt severely punished. They hadn't caused the war, their leaders did, but they were the ones being punished. They had war debts to repay, and without colonies, there was no real way that the Weimar Republic could do that. They were unable to defend themselves from future attacks, so they felt vulnerable. And like I said before, the Treaty of Versailles created the climate where a guy like Adolf Hitler could rise to power very quickly. End of part one, so I'm going to stop this here before we move on into life between the wars. Take some time, review this, make sure you know it. Your final has 4 parts, and when you feel confident, go on to part 2. MDub out.